to the President, Chancellor, faculty, to you, the students who are graduating today, the members of your families and other guests here. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very special day here today in Geneva. I think the motto that the Chancellor set out, which is not to really spend much time on Brexit, is a very tempting invitation, Claude, because I think to many of us it remains a very difficult thing to understand, to interpret, and I may come back to it just towards the end of my presentation. But let me first turn to you, the students who are graduating today. I want to congratulate you. This is a special day. It's as somebody recently said, well, the first day of the rest of my life. But it really means something on the day that you graduate, because it is that watershed between where you grew up, where people looked after you, where others basically told you what to do, taught you, shared with you their insights, also had their wallets available to pay for your education. I'm sure parents will be very happy to see you graduating today. And yet you suddenly stand there and you think, I now know more than most people who have taught me, because that is a sensation that you often have. And certainly you will, as you step out of your education here and begin to enter the world of business or government or science or non-profit organizations, you will have that strange sensation that you do actually know a lot more than those who you will work for. And that is the first moment at which you begin to sort of have a sensation of, why am I doing what I'm doing if I'm actually better qualified than those who I will work for? Why do I say that at the beginning of a speech on a graduation day? Because in some senses, this is the moment where suddenly you will also realize that everything you have learned is knowledge, but it's not wisdom. And wisdom is not necessarily something that is a matter of age. I think sometimes in our world, we do think that, wisdom is something that only older people bring to our communities, to our societies. No, wisdom is, I think, using the knowledge that you have acquired with perspective, to look at yourself not only through the eyes of somebody else looking at you, but rather look out to those around you. Claude Martin mentioned in his speech this strange phenomenon of inequality in our society. We celebrate that inequality most of the time because wealth and being rich and being able to afford many things is actually something that we have, for a long time considered to be a great sign of success. So why is it that we suddenly in our time are beginning to feel more and more uncomfortable with this notion of inequality? Because if you're rich, you must have done something right. You must have been either very clever, very lucky, very successful, used that knowledge that you acquired through your university education and turned it into something. And I think it is in part related to a word that you just used, compassion. Success is something that is both a tribute to you as an individual, but I think increasingly we are also sensing that success that simply translates into more wealth has little to do with what actually makes our lives meaningful. We can be rich, and once you've had your first million, the next 10 million really don't change your life that much. But it's interesting when you say 4,000 francs can literally change the life of an entire village, between having water and not having water. It's existential. And suddenly this notion of money and wealth and the quantity of it takes on a very different meaning and dimension. So I want to, in my brief remarks, say to you today, you are about to enter that life of extraordinary opportunity. You are already amongst the most fortunate of your generation, but we are also the most fortunate generation in human history. We live in a time where this world has more wealth, more knowledge, more science, more technology, more breakthroughs, more opportunities, more dreams that will not remain dreams but will actually become possible than any generation before us. That is not to negate inequality, it is not to negate many of the things that are not going right, but there is no question that our generation, your generation, is the most fortunate, if you want, from a point of view of where you are starting from. And I was struck for a moment that we both today have come not from Geneva, New York, London. We both flew into Geneva to join your ceremony from a city called Nairobi, Kenya, in the heart of Africa. We are both not Kenyans, but we have found ourselves working on the continent of Africa, which also says something about how things are changing in our world. A capital city of a country such as Kenya, on a continent of 1 billion people today in Africa, is going to be part of a shifting center of gravity, economic, political, in terms of dynamism and opportunities in the years to come. Many people often still focus on China, 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 and rightly so, because China has been the singularly most dramatic change factor, certainly in my adult life, in so many respects. But just think of a continent like Africa, where today there is 1 billion people, and in 40 years' time there will be 2 billion people. Now, many of you are going to enter into the world of business, or finance, or economics. It doesn't take much imagination to realize that the way the world looks today is not the way it's going to look in 20, and certainly not in 30 or 40 years' time. These are opportunities that are not just imaginary. Few people reflect on the fact that we have eradicated polio. If you ever had polio, or you knew somebody who had polio, you know what this means. Few people realize that just in the last 15 years, we have reduced malaria on the African continent by 70%. People have been lifted out of poverty in their hundreds of millions. And there are some extraordinary graphs, and I won't go into detail now, but when you look at where China was in 1998 and where it is today, then it is the country with the most remarkable poverty reduction record ever in human history, accomplished in just one generation. These are the opportunities that are there for you to seize, and yet you have to make choices. You will have to make choices every day of your life. Some of them obviously much more dramatic. Maybe who you marry can be a very dramatic choice. Where you will take your first job, or maybe you don't have a choice and you will simply have to take the one that presents itself to you. But all along the rest of your life, you will have to make choices, and you will have to make those choices at a time where, despite where I began the message that I wanted to bring to you today, that of extraordinary opportunity, we are also a generation that with our choices will literally determine where people 150 years from now will either have a choice or not have a choice. Some of you may have heard of this notion of living in the age of the Anthropocene. What it basically says is that in the history of this planet, and in the history of our presence as humans on it, we have somewhere in the last 100 years entered an age where for the first time we as a species have become the dominant factor of what happens on this planet. Now, in many respects, that is an extraordinary achievement. It has enabled us to grow older, and probably some of you will already be living well beyond the age of 100, because by 2050 it is very likely that the average life expectation, certainly in wealthier societies, will be around 120 years. I'm not sure we will necessarily desire to reach that age with all the spare parts we will need, but that is what is ahead of us. But living in the age of the Anthropocene essentially tries to point to two phenomena. One, that we are changing the fundamental life support systems on this planet. We have managed in just 3 or 4 generations to change what happens in the atmosphere. We have also, through our collective impact, begun to affect life in the biosphere. Human impact on our planet today has caused the 6th extinction crisis. We are losing species, habitat, the life support systems that we think are luxury, such as forests and wetlands and oceans and fisheries and so on, at a rate that is unprecedented. Because we have become, through technology, science, but also through sheer numbers. Remember, from 1 billion people 300 years ago, we are now 7 billion people. And in just the next 40 years, we will add another 3 billion people to our global population. These are just a few numbers that say to you, you are a generation that will make choices that in their implications and impact on what happens next in this world to your children and your grandchildren is without precedent. And that is why I want to go back to where Claude Martin set the theme for today. Success can be a purely narcissistic experience, and many people, have a good time living that life of, I did it, and I've done it really well, and I don't owe anybody anything. What I would appeal to you is wherever you are, and this is not a matter of being a do-gooder or being a business person or a political leader or a scientist. It doesn't matter where you work. Maintain your perspective. Look around you and realize that you may be a CFO in a company. You may be a member of parliament. You may be somebody in marketing and advertising or in international relations or diplomacy. What you do matters well beyond that which you take home in the evening as a tick against a box, I did X, Y, and Z. Because collectively, we do actually have very much the power to influence what happens in our world. Living in the age of the Anthropocene is not only about that doom and gloom scenario of what is happening around us. The other half of the message is, because we know so much today, because we have more science and technology and financial means, we actually can use that to also make the world a better place, to put it very simply. Sustainability and equity, I think, are going to be the two issues that will either tear this world apart or will allow us to live with 10 billion people together on this planet and make it a great success story. It is in the choices that you will make as individuals, as members of a family, a community, a business. In Switzerland, actually something that very often people underestimate is captured and reflected in the political culture of this country. When I lived outside Switzerland, had never set foot here, I always wondered, why does Switzerland not want to join the European Union? And sometimes I still wonder. But after spending 5 years living in a commune in the canton of Vaud and seeing how people have evolved a culture of governance that begins literally in my neighborhood and is powerful and assumes responsibility for what happens in that community, through the commune, in the canton, and the canton to the nation, I began to understand that yes, we developed different cultures of governing ourselves. And in the choices that we may not always be at a point in time where we make the difference between war and peace. But I think often it is too easy to say that, it is the big people who make the big decisions. First of all, in most countries, we vote those big people into power. So that's where our first responsibility starts. But also when you're in a business or in an organization or in a family and you're bringing up children, what you live in your own life as an example, I think is the beginning of making the choice that ultimately will either lead us into greater trouble or to both personal success and collective success. Let me end by just saying, I began my life, as Claude often says, he, in a sense, views himself in the tradition of being the son of a mountain farmer in the Alps, which sort of has this image of, having grown up with a few cows and knowing that there is another country on the neighboring side of the border, which is the exact opposite of what his life has become. Because I just want to pay a tribute to Claude Martin. I consider him one of the great leaders of our environmental community, but well beyond that. And the fact that he is a chancellor of the International University in Geneva, I think just says in how many ways he has taken that notion of making choices and taking responsibility and bringing his own convictions to audiences and to communities well beyond where maybe he would love to spend his time. I was born as the son of a farming couple in Brazil. German parents, they had gone to Brazil. And through many choices, coincidences, fortunate opportunities, I found myself in the last 10 years being at the heart of multilateralism, of the United Nations, that great idea born after the catastrophe of the Second World War, and often maligned today in a world in which contradictions and conflicts and failures of diplomacy are not exactly making us look at the world with great optimism. But let me tell you, I leave my role as an UN Under-Secretary General after 10 years with a deeper conviction about the notion of multilateralism, of the idea encapsulated in the Charter of the United Nations, which begins with the word "we the people," who, on the ruins of a failed world system, allowed a terrible, terrible period to befall mankind, wreak destruction and suffering unprecedented in human history. As you set out, remember, you may not be a United Nations official, you may not even be a politician or a CEO, but you are part of that body politic that will either allow strange people to lead us in the wrong direction, or to ensure that you are part of the way that our societies make choices. I hope that in whatever comes next in your lives, you will find personal satisfaction, but that you will maintain that perspective for those around you and for what happens around you. And sometimes, success may not end up being measured in your bank accounts and maybe putting you in that group of 56 or however many it was. But let me end with a quote by Robert Louis Stevenson that struck me as being very poignant at this moment in time. Don't judge the day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds you sow. Good luck to you, and thank you very much for having me here today.